Machado, and I'm going to report all about the 1973 Philippines Constitution, excerpt from the 1973 Philippines Constitution, and excluding all amendments that are followed. So what is 1973 Philippines Constitution? It had already begun even before the martial law period. As early as 1967, the Congress passed a resolution that would officially change the existing in 1935 Constitution, and by 1970, the delegates of Constitutional Convention were elected through Republic Act number 6132. So, in June 1971, the elected members of the convention began its duties to drafting the new constitution. Under the leadership of former President Carlos B. Garcia, and also, however, in his death in 3 days, after being officially sworn as President of the Convention, introduced by former President Diosdado Macapagal, and to take the helm as well, although martial law had been declared since in 1972 in September, and the convention produced their final work on December 1 of the same year. So what is a constitution convention? So it is the one of the three methods by which the Philippines Constitution could be amended under the existing in 1987 Constitution, while the Citizens' Assembly, according to President Marcos' presidential decree in number 56, that can be composed of all persons who are residents of the barrio, district, or barangay for at least 6 months and 15 years of age or above, and the citizens of the Philippines and who are registered in the list of a barangay. And now we have three branches of being the lawmakers, which is the president or the executive. So what is the main current job of the president? So the president shall be elected from among the members of the National Assembly by majority vote of all its members for terms of 6 years from the date he takes his oath out of his office, which shall not be later than 3 days after his proclamation by the National Assembly, nor in any case earlier than the expiration of the term of his predecessor. Upon taking his oath of office, the President shall cease to be a member of the National Assembly and of any political party. Up next will be the National Assembly from the Article 8. The National Assembly shall be composed of as many members as may be provided by law to be apportioned among the provinces, representatives from districts and cities in accordance with the number of their respective inhabitants and on the basis of a uniform and progressive ratio. Well, here is the thing about the parliamentary system of the government. Let me give you a definition. So, a government system that governs and through the assembly or parliament, thereby fusing the legislative and executive branches. So, what is a presidential system of a government? So, a system that applies the separation of government functions into three different branches, such as I mentioned earlier, the executive, the legislative, and lastly, the judiciary. So Article 9, the Prime Minister and also the Cabinet Officers. So the executive power shall be exercised by the Prime Minister with the assistance of the Cabinet. The Cabinet headed by the Prime Minister shall consist of the heads of ministries as provided by the law, and also the Prime Minister shall be the head and of the government. And lastly will be Article 10, the Judiciary. So what's the power of the judicial person? So it shall be vested in one Supreme Court and in such inferior counts as may be established by law. So the National Assembly shall have the power to define, prescribe, and apportion the jurisdiction of the various courts, but may not be deprived the Supreme Court of its jurisdiction. Government. So what is a parliamentary government? So as we all know, it is a democratic system. So where the head of the government is accountable to the legislature and is elected by nominated by it. And also the legislature is made up of elected representatives who form a parliament which is responsible for making laws. Well, here's a simple breakdown in order to fully understand. The National Assembly. So it was a group of elected officials that made laws and chose the country's leaders. So this is what we call the National Assembly. While the Prime Minister, it is the head of the government, elected by the National Assembly, and manage the country's day-to-day affairs. While the President or the Executive, it is a ceremonial leader or head of state elected by the National Assembly, and the Cabinet, advisors and administrators appointed by the Prime Minister to help run the government. And now, and how does it work? Well, let me tell you. The Prime Minister and Cabinet were accountable to the National Assembly, which could remove them through a vote of no confidence. So this kind of a system blended the powers of making laws and running the government, unlike the strict separation what has been seen in the previous presidential system. However, during martial law, President Ferdinand Marcos centralized power, making the parliamentary setup mostly symbolic. And now, based on the excerpts, how could the president assume or control or influence over the National Assembly? By declaring a martial law, which is a best example. So the president could take over the legislative powers and control the government directly. And also, one of the best examples is amendments. Changes to the Constitution could give the president more authority over the National Assembly, like allowing them to appoint or influence its members. So these actions allowed the president to bypass or dominate the National Assembly, weakening its independence. Another question is, how was government power distributed between the president and the prime minister? So under the 1973 Philippines Constitution, the government power was shared like this, in example. President, so the president, as we all know, is the head of state, and also a ceremonial leader, and represents the country and has a limited real power. While the prime minister was also the head of a government, managed the country's daily affairs, so held most of the executive power, like running the government and implementing laws. So in theory, the prime minister was more powerful, but during the martial law by Ferdinand Marcos, used emergency powers to control both roles effectively and centralizing power in himself. So in turn, what were the features of the National Assembly and what was its role in government? The National Assembly under the 1973 Philippines Constitution had these features and roles. At first, unicameral. It was a single-chamber legislature which is unicameral, while the elected members were chosen by the people, so they were SSB members, while leader it was led by a speaker elected by the assembly members. So the role in government, of course, the most very simple thing, making laws and policies. Well, of course, the government, it is the main job to create and pass the laws. And electing leaders, it chose the president and the prime minister. Accountability. It could remove the Prime Minister and Cabinet through a vote of no confidence. So the National Assembly was the center of legislative and some executive power, but during martial law, its independence was weakened as President Marcos consolidated power. Read the excerpt from Presidential Decree number 1033 in 1976 amendments to the 1973 Philippine Constitution. So the 1973 Philippines Constitution was amended the four times between 1976 and 1984. Significant changes to the Constitution happened in 1981 when the government system reverted back to the presidential from parliamentary, and in 1984 when the office of the vice president was created to follow the president in the chain of command. Do you know what is Batasang Pambansa? So Batasang Pambansa, it pertains to the unicameral legislative branch created through the 1976 amendments to the Philippines Constitution. It formally replaced the unicameral and National Assembly formed under the 1973 Charter. Last guide question. How did the President assume legislative powers amidst the creation of an interim Batasang Pambansa? Despite the creation of the interim Batasang Pambansa, or a temporary legislature, which is in short, so the President Marcos retained legislative powers by leveraging the following mechanisms. The martial law powers. So as martial law was still in effect, Marcos continued to issue presidential decrees which had the force of law, and these decrees allowed him to bypass the legislative process entirely. According to the presidential decree, how did President Marcos expand the powers and duties of the president? So President Marcos expanded the powers and duties of the president through presidential decrees issued during the martial law. And here's how he did it. First will be the legislative powers. So Marcos gave himself the authority to make laws, bypassing the National Assembly. Number two will be control over government. He centralized power by controlling both the executive and legislative branches. And also, he could appoint key officials and dismiss the government leaders without needing approval. How scary is that? And prolonging the martial law. Martial law allowed him to suspend civil rights and override normal government processes, and he used it to maintain power and suppress opposition. And then lastly will be the constitutional amendments. Through decrees, he introduces the changes of the 1973 Constitution that granted him more authority and weakening the roles of the Prime Minister and also the National Assembly. So this kind of an actions made the President the most powerful figure in government and concentrating nearly all powers in his hands.